Well, it's 6:30. One of the things that when I saw your promotional thing and I looked at it to figure out what you were telling everyone to expect. In an hour, Alethea, you took my class, right?
Mhm.
I can't finish anything in an hour. So I'm going to try my best to get through the slideshow that I've made for everybody, but who knows? This is the first time I'm doing this. We could go on for some time or we could wrap it up in a few minutes. I don't know. So bear with me. Thank you for doing this. And again, for everybody who's been living this weird life of seeing people on a screen like this, I'm still kind of new to this and it is so weird. You guys are getting more accustomed to it. But anyway, I feel for all of you who are trying to learn this way. And I'm really grateful that you took an evening when you could probably be doing other. I remember when I was in college, man, I wouldn't have done this. I was out drinking. And thank you. Thank you for being, oh, I'm not supposed to say that? Oops.
All right.
That's okay. I tried to pepper the slideshow with a few life lessons as well as some beekeeping things. So take that for what it's worth. Anyway, college is, I can't imagine it's in any way similar to my experience as a college student. So thank you again for being here. Do anybody want to do a prefatory thing? McKayla, you want to welcome everybody or should I just jump right into it?
I think you just jump right in. I think you did a good introduction so far, so.
Thank you. I'm just killing time.
Anyway. I actually do want to just let everybody know that we're just so appreciative, Phil, that you were willing to do this, and that I want to give a huge shout out to you and the Honey Exchange, because you guys have supported the Honeybee Conservation Club for years now. You got us started with our first donation of hive parts and everything, and we wouldn't have been able to get started so quickly with them without your help. So just a huge thank you.
Oh, thank you. You're welcome. I've enjoyed the interactions that we've had since you and I met, and watching the club kind of grow and become something for real. There was a period of my time where I really didn't believe that we would have such things happening at schools. I thought everybody was just too scared of the sting thing. So I'm thrilled that it's happening and we can be a part of it. One of the things I talk about a lot is that I chose a career that's, I'm not rolling in money and doing this, and I work a lot of hours, but I love what I do. And this kind of thing is the most rewarding part of my job. I can sell bottles of honey all day long, but to actually be able to talk to people who are listening and care, that's why I get up in the morning. So thanks again for being here. Let's look at some pictures because you don't want to look at my face all day. Being successful. I think the jury's still out on that. But I liked your title, so I ran with it. Life of Beekeeper. I'm supposed to tell a little about myself. That's one of the things I'm not super comfortable doing. I'd rather talk about other things. But just to let you know who I am, obviously I'm Phil from the Honey Exchange. My wife, Megan, and I, we opened the place about a decade ago. And, we've been sort of fighting a slow uphill battle ever since, but doing something that we really care about and trying to make a difference in our community. And then the world, as we just discussed, got flipped upside down for everybody. The weirdest thing that has happened to me in my 54 years on the planet is that a global pandemic it made our business more successful and we're having a hard time keeping up with the beekeeping business right now. It turns out that beekeeping is one of these natural, socially distant things. Most beekeepers are kind of naturally distancers anyway, like 6 feet is kind of close for most of us. And so it just weirdly clicked that a lot of people, they got into sourdough baking, they got big into gardening and fixing their houses up. And a lot of people got into beekeeping. So it's really been fun to watch this new explosion. We were on a slow, steady trajectory with new beekeepers for years and years, but now it's really going crazy. So I know people who have been beekeepers their whole life. Like one of my friends, he was born a beekeeper. His father was a rabbi and a beekeeper, and he remembers being a child out among the bees. And it's part of who David defines himself as. I came into it very late in life. My father is very different from that. My father's one of the classic animal haters of the world. He's kind of famous for saying, I don't understand why people let animals live in the house with them. He's very puzzled by that. And now he's got, like at our house, we've got a cat, a dog, chickens, thousands of bees, tens of thousands of bees. My sister has 3 dogs. My brother actually, he raises greyhounds. Anyway, the whole family's gone completely off the rails as far as my father's concerned. But I came into beekeeping as a full-grown adult. This is my second career. I had a bunch of years as a restaurant manager and thought that was what I wanted to do with my life. And I saw myself aging really fast and thought maybe I need to do something else. So my wife and I were looking around at the world. We were living in Chicago, and we needed a change in our lives. We had kids who were getting ready to go to school as little ones, and we didn't want to stay in Chicago and do that. So we looked around at the world, and my wife had a job that she could just unplug from one place. And as long as she had an internet connection, she could plug in her job anywhere. So we looked around at the country and thought we were going to end up in Portland, Oregon. Went out there, and it didn't really jive. It didn't work perfectly. It was a lovely place to visit, but it didn't feel like home. And then while we were getting ready to do that, some other people, they said, "Oh, you're going to Portland? Oh, you're going to love Portland. You guys are so Maine." And like my wife's from California. I'm from outside of Chicago. I didn't even know what that meant. I'm not sure to this day if it's a compliment or an insult. But we thought, well, that's something to check out because there's people whose opinion we trust. So we came out and immediately fell in love with Portland and just felt like this is where we belonged. And I've felt that way ever since. But I was able to be a stay-at-home dad for about 7 years. And it was just one of the greatest periods of my life, just being able to dedicate it to my kids and be a dad. And it was just fantastic. I did have a little too much spare time at that time. And the kids were up the end of the block at the bakery. We live near Scratch Bakery in South Portland, if you know what that is. And there were these girls out in front of the bakery when my girls were little. And they were actually trying to change the law in South Portland to allow people to have chickens. It wasn't allowed when we first moved in there. And there were some kids who said, well, we're going to have chickens, and we think that's a dumb law. So these kids of like 11 and 13, they had help from their parents. But basically, these kids changed the ordinance in South Portland to allow for the keeping of chickens. And they gave the sales pitch to my kids up at the bakery because they were trying to, drum up support for it. My kids came back and they're like, "Dad, we got to get chickens." And my wife, on the way home, I didn't know this, she had said, "If you can convince your father, we'll get chickens." She's thinking, this is Dick Gavin's son. There's no way in heck, he's not going to do that. But the kids made such a compelling argument for chickens. It's a pet you get something from. That's cool. I like fresh eggs. So they sold me on it. But I said, all right, but if I'm going to build you guys a chicken coop and let you do your chicken project, I'm finally going to get my beehive. And I've been sort of pondering that for a few years because I was friends with a guy in college. He grew up in the suburbs of Rochester, New York. Pretty much the same suburban upbringing that I had, but his parents were beekeepers. And it was the first I'd ever heard of it at the age of 19. I'm like, wait a minute, your parents are beekeepers? You're like a suburban kid going to college. And it was very unusual at that time. But I thought that was my kind of unusual. And it just kind of stuck in the back of my mind for the longest time. And then when I was, what have I done? I'm trying to change my slides in the middle of a conversation. Secret Life of Bees. If you haven't read The Secret Life of Bees, can we have a show of hands who's read and who hasn't read The Secret Life of Bees? 1, 2. All right. My track record still holds. I asked that at the last class of every class that I've taught. And I've taught about 700 students over the last 10 years. In that time, one man has ever raised his hand that he's read The Secret Life of Bees other than myself. And I think it's a disgrace. I think it needs to be fixed. And I think, gentlemen, you should go out and assess whether you have put this into a category called chick literature. That's a dumb category. We shouldn't have that category. So bring it back. Read the book. It's great. Changed my life. If you haven't read it, it's a wonderful story. It starts as a civil rights tale, and I could not think of anything more important right now to read. Do that. And then it's a great novel. But along the way, at the beginning of each chapter, there's a little snippet that tells you something about bees and beekeeping. And I thought, this is fascinating. I want to know more about this. And I started kind of scratching at it. And beekeeping is one of those subjects where you scratch at it and you realize there's something else under that that's even more fascinating than the thing you might have been scratching at. So the more I scratched, the more I thought, this is really something that I think I could really get into. It's just weird enough that it could be a hobby I can get behind. So I got my beehive, and I thought at that time, man, I'm a weirdo. I'm the weirdest guy in the country. I must be the only person who's had this idea. Turns out I was part of a nationwide phenomenon of people having that very same realization. They'd heard something about bees and their importance and the crisis that they were having. And people by the hundreds of thousands just started making that decision. You know, I want to be a beekeeper now. I want to be part of the solution rather than just another part of the problem. So it was fun to be in the, you know, the early stages of that. And like I said, that went on for 15 years so far. It's not tapering off yet. It just took a big upswing and it's kind of nuts. So I'm glad of it. I think the more people that we have getting involved in this, the better our whole planet's going to be. And not just from a bee perspective, but from a natural perspective. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But this is, I spent a lot of time, as I was just saying to Alithia, spending time editing videos and making my classes updated. I went back to my original first video I ever took, and I realized just how terrible it was. Like, times have really changed dramatically for the better in terms of technology. So bear with me while we get to see this. You're gonna want to catch swarms after you talk to me. We caught a swarm. A friend of mine, a firefighter, called me up. I'm like, dude, you run into burning buildings for your job. Go collect the swarm. He's like, no way, that's terrifying.
Although,
so I got
there
it.
was a skunk hanging around here last night, so it's made him a little testy.
And there you go. That was me hiving my first swarm. It was 2009. And I didn't think I was ready for it. Like, in beekeeping class, I had heard about this swarm capture thing and how people really got excited about that. I'm like, no way, that is crazy. But it was a friend in need. And so I went and bailed him out. And it was the most exciting thing that I had maybe done ever before. And now I just chomp at the bit. I'm waiting. It's probably about 3 weeks away, maybe 4. I don't know. It's close enough, though, that the phone is going to ring soon and somebody's going to say, I've got a swarm of bees hanging in my tree. Can you help? And I'll be like, yeah, I'll be right over. It's the best thing in the world. So I got into that. The other thing I got into when my kids were little, because I was a stay-at-home dad with all this time, of course, is I went over and I started teaching their classes, you know, the second graders and the kindergartners. And I brought a little presentation along, and I found that I really liked teaching people about this. Really, kids, students of any age, anybody who will listen to me, basically. I just love talking about it, and I love thinking about it, and I love sharing the joy of this crazy thing that we do with other people. So that's kind of how the honey exchange started to evolve. And when my kids were in middle school, they didn't need their dad quite so much, and my wife kind of needed me to find something to do. We said, well, let's do something together because we really like each other, and we decided to open a business that tries to chase after something that we're passionate about. And I would recommend that to anybody. If you can do it, that's great. As long as you figure out how to pay your rent. It's a different time from my grandparents' age. Not that my grandparents were beekeepers. They were every bit as big animal haters as my father. But it's not like it was back in the day. Back in our grandparents' age, you could just get a swarm of bees for $25 and put it into a hive and leave it alone, and probably cast a swarm every spring, and you could catch it or not. You can make splits if you wanted to, and it would just go for years and years without too much attention and care. We humans have done some things to the globe that, in retrospect, perhaps we should not have done. We accidentally moved a parasite from one side of the globe to the other very quickly, and the globe can't cope with that very well. And so the bees as a species, as a bunch of species actually, are being really challenged by the alterations that we humans have made to their planet. And now if you want to look after a beehive, it requires much more care and attention than it ever did. And another thing that's a little bit disheartening is that over the 10 years I've been teaching this class, it's gotten harder. The mites have gotten worse. The viruses have gotten more virulent. And it's beekeepers who were taking my class in the beginning, like Alethea. I think we've had this conversation that what I was teaching you more than 5 years ago is no longer working. I was using that program. I was sticking with what I was teaching. And then the winter before last, I lost all of my hives, 6 out of 6 dead in the spring through my failure to keep ahead of their Varroa mites. And I dug down and I talked to the state inspector and I did a bunch of research and learned what went wrong. And I tried to adjust to that. And now, touch wood so far, now I've got 5 alive out of 6, and that's a much better track record of something I can be proud of. But it's not something that you can just wrap up. And so I just kind of want to preface, in case there was somebody who was thinking they were going to go out of tonight ready to keep a beehive, you know, it's a 10-hour class at least, just to get the fundamental basics up and going. So the reason I chose this beautiful picture of Talasa is that she is actually teaching a class. So if you really want to get into it and you want to take a beginner class, there's one that's beginning on Saturday. It's $125. If that's too tight for your budget, call me. We'll work it out. I like having students. but it's 10 o'clock in the morning and it will run. It's a 5-session class, but there's a week where we're not going to do it in the middle, which is the week that we're bringing packaged bees up. So we can't have a class here because it's going to be chaos. Reading books, that's how I got into it. I was a loner at first and I read everything I could find. I recommend that if you want to be a beekeeper, you will never run out of things to read that will be informative to your success and failure. Joining your club, the fact that your school has a club is tremendous. If you're going to get out into a community, join that community's beekeeping club. The Cumberland County Beekeepers and the York County Beekeepers, wonderful, active groups who love to share and love to help their peers succeed. Our website, thehoneyexchange.com, I'll draw your attention to that. If you want to see what you can learn just from that, you could go onto our beekeeping resources page and you could actually you could look at the slideshows from all the classes and act like you were in the class if you want to. But there's a lot of stuff that you can find there. And I really recommend that you do. If you want to do the best you can for bees, there's just stuff you got to learn right now. You got to learn how we can do it. Before you get in, I always try to warn everybody that it's hard. You're going to see bees die. And not everyone is prepared for that. Some people don't realize that a box of stinging insects is something that they will become attached to. You know, you invest money in your hive, you invest your time in your hive. For a lot of us, we invest our emotions in our hive. There was actually out back on the porch, there was a hive that had made it through the winter. And I was so excited because it was this long shot. It was a Frankenhive. It had been cobbled together just from the craziest miscellany of bees. But the fact they made it through until spring and then we're out flying, I was so excited. And then for about a week, I didn't see them flying. I thought, darn it, they died. And it made me really sad. Like, this is my job. I do this, you know, we sold 300 packages of bees to people with dead hives. And so I get to talk about it all day. I get to hear about it all day. But that little baby out there that I had cared so much for, I thought it was dead. Then it got warm again and they started flying and I was so relieved. And this emotional roller coaster is not something that I would have ever predicted when I first started looking into books about bees and beekeeping. You know, I thought, they're bugs, they sting. I'm not going to fall in love with that. But in a way, you kind of do. So you got to be prepared for that. Like I said, it's hard to keep a hive alive. If you can get 3/4 of your hives through the winter, that's a tremendous achievement in Maine. I think the batting average statewide is a little better than half hives coming through the winter. You know, I know some beekeepers who can get 80, 90% through, but even those beekeepers, every one of them has a story like mine where they just took a beating one winter and they just lost it all and had to start from scratch. And that can be disheartening. So I want to let you know that that's where you're starting. Your starting point is there's going to be some heartbreak along the way and prepare for that. But I say this to any student who will listen to me, that you are going to learn as you go through your life that the things you fail at are probably going to teach you more lessons than the things you succeed at. Life is a cruel teacher in that regard, but having walked the planet, like I said, for 54 years now, that's at least been my life experience. And I think it's a lot of people's life experience. It will definitely be your life experience as a beekeeper. One of the things that I find frustrating is people who sort of refuse to learn from their mistakes and just keep trying the same thing over and over. You know, it's that somebody's definition of insanity, right? Is trying the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome. That's madness. So if you have a failure, dig down and try to figure it out, learn what you can from it, dust yourself off and move on. We could talk for 10 hours about challenges that you'll face. The only one I want to talk about is Varroa mites. And I tell my beginner students this right at the beginning. If you learn one thing about bees, learn how to understand, monitor, and control Varroa mites. If you don't do that, you will fail for certain. If you do that, you will have success. You won't have 100% success, but you'll be way ahead of everybody else. That's the thing that the bees cannot do on their own. There's a parasite, and it takes generations for an animal to reach what's called a parasite host equilibrium. It's not reasonable for a parasite to kill its host every year. That's not good for the parasite. So eventually parasites will reach equilibrium with their host. Our grandparents' challenge was tracheal mites. You might read about that if you're opening older textbooks. We don't even talk about tracheal mites anymore because the bees and the mites in that regard have found their balance. The mites are there, the tracheal mites, they're there. They're a low-level problem, but the bees have developed a resistance to them over many, many, many generations of bees. The Varroa mites, that hasn't happened yet, and it's not going to happen It may not happen in my lifetime. It may not happen in your lifetime. I don't know. But it's problematic right now. And it's the problem that if you don't address it, your hive will absolutely die. We talk about in class, the challenge of mites is not to see them when your hive is dying. That's easy. This hive, this bee's got deformed wing virus. It's a virus that happens while the bee is in gestation. It's vectored by these Varroa mites. The Varroa mites are, they get into the larva. They feed on the fat bodies of the bees. Recent research has shown that the fat bodies of the bees function sort of like your kidneys do. They're filtering toxins out of the bee. So to have an injection of virus directly into your immune system is not good. You need to study science to understand that. If you look really closely in this other photograph, though, there's a mite between the scales of the abdomen of this bee. You see that kind of reddish brown oval sticking in there? That's where the mites like to hang out. The bees can't get them out because they're stuck between the segments. They also like to hang around on the section between abdomen and thorax on the belly side. So if you're looking for mites on the back of your bees, by the time you see them there, your hive's probably on its way to being dead already. So you got to stay ahead of them all the time. And how you stay ahead of them, that's a 10-hour class. I mean, it's just the mite management part of the beginner class that we teach is half of 3 of the classes. It's a full 6 hours of what you just need to know just for Varroa mites. So learn about that. If you don't learn about anything else, you'll still be way ahead with Varroa mites. As you get out into the world and you need to start figuring out where's your hive going to go in your own yard, or if you're, we do have college students that are just basically borrowing land on other people's properties. If you want to keep a hive somewhere else, give us a call. We might actually know somebody who would love to have hives on their property, but just don't want to keep them themselves. So we do that kind of matchmaking around. But being a good neighbor is, I think, essential not only to, just being a good human being, but good beekeeping. Because if your neighbor wants to make your beekeeping life a misery, they absolutely can, and they absolutely will. In most towns, they can't do anything legally to stop you from doing it. Most every town has allowed that now. I think South Portland has an ordinance that's a little weird. Westbrook still requires people to register their hives and be on their best behavior. But City of Portland, here, there's no regulation at all. And most towns have removed their regulations. But that doesn't remove your responsibility to be a decent human being, does it? So have a conversation with your neighbors, or at least drop off a postcard and saying, here's my plan. I'm going to be keeping a hive next door, and here's what I expect them to do. And we talk, we spend another hour or so talking about finding the perfect site on a location. And a big part of that is trying to choose a site where the bees aren't menacing your neighbors and making it hard for them to enjoy their property. So if you present your plan to your neighbor, they're going to hear that you have considered them before they have a chance to say no. And they very rarely will say no. Most beekeepers are really, or most neighbors get really into it. I've got hives on 6 different properties now. And the neighbors of all those, like there's this one woman who's a little weird. She's kind of just nervous about being outdoors, I think. No judgment. That's her deal. And so a few bees around her bird bath, that makes her edgy. It makes her feel uneasy and uncomfortable. So, we encountered her. We made some changes to where our hives are, and I think we made her happy by just caring. And you'll find that in most aspects of life, that goes a long way. Like, I have kind of a cynical way that I say that the impression of caring is more important than actually caring. If you can do both, that's a good human being. But if you could choose one, at least choose the impression of caring, because then at least you're the impression of a good person. Being a good person, I can't say enough about that. We got to be kind to each other. It's the only way. There's a very good, you're not gonna be able to get to this link. On our website, you can get to this link though. This is on slideshow number 2 for classes. Or you can go to the state of Maine Department of Agriculture, and you can get Jennifer Lunn. She's a brilliant beekeeper. And she's got a whole page on just honeybee etiquette, how to be a good neighbor and be a good person. If you got a neighbor with a pool, that's always going to be a challenge. Bees love to go out and get into water because they need to bring it back to the hive and share it with their sisters. They don't store any water in the hive, so they have to go and get it efficiently and bring it back. A neighbor with a pool, that's really hard, and I'll tell you why. It's the way bees communicate. So this may be something you've seen before, but I can watch this day after day and never stop being fascinated by it. You see the bee who's kind of just below center there doing dance around. She's circling around and waggling around. She's doing the round dance. The round dance is telling her sisters, there's water around here within about 80 meters, about 100 yards. There's this water that I have in my belly. And the other ones have to then smell it and figure out, okay, I've got this smell and I know it's nearby, and now they have to go find it. And when they go looking for that, if it's chlorinated water, it's really easy for them to find because it stinks like chlorine. And then they find this big giant blue thing that's really easy to find visually. And they're going to get into that water and they're going to get some water and they're going to bring it back. If you're a beekeeper and you got bees in your pool, you know that they're just coming to get some water and they're coming to take it home. They're not there to menace anybody. They're not guard bees who are on the defensive. They're just worker bees who are trying to get some water. So if you can leave them all well enough alone, that's great. It's the people who are not beekeepers who see that dozen or so or maybe more bees. And then as the feedback loop starts to increase, you know, they may get more bees at their pool than they really enjoy being around. I always tell those folks, you know, once they're in your pool, you get to drown them, you get to smoosh them. That's fair. You're paying rent, they're not paying rent. But if you can break that communication loop, then that's going to stop more bees from coming back to your pool. I meet people all the time who are like, oh, the bees are getting in the pool and we bring them over to the side and let them dry out and they fly away. And I'm like, yeah, it's flying back to tell sisters about this awesome giant blue water source. So as a beekeeper, you got to keep something that's nearer to your hive than that next nearest nuisance. And that's for where we are, it's very important. If you haven't been to the Honey Exchange, we're on Stevens Avenue. So we've got businesses and apartments on both sides. Lincoln Middle School is a stone's throw behind us. So we're in a really concentrated community. But because of how we've got water situated and how we've got the bees oriented, so far the neighbors have been really enthusiastic about the project. And you'll, I think, find that that's generally the rule. Take a breath. I can't do an hour and a half without breathing. You ever had a teacher just die? Just talk, and bam. I could see doing that. Sorry, distracted myself. As long as we're talking about dancing, this is one of the things that I love to just sort of stop and talk about. I love talking about bees, right? With each layer that you unveil, you pull that off and there's another layer under it. Like, whoa, this is even cooler. There's another dance, the waggle dance. This boggles my mind every time I look at it. The bee in the center, she's going to circle around and waggle, waggle, waggle. Circle clockwise, waggle, waggle, waggle. Circle counterclockwise, waggle, waggle, waggle. Repeat. She's got pollen on her back legs. And she's telling the bees who are circling around her and also a bunch of bees who are elsewhere in the hive, they're picking up the vibration of that dance. They're so in tune with the vibrations that they can understand it from a distance. It's another thing. It's that they don't need their ears. They don't need their eyes for this. They're sensing it and they're sensing directions. So she's saying if the sun is up here at compass north, you got to travel at that 4 o'clock or so position away from the hive. And how long she waggles tells them the distance that they have to travel. It's a distance of about 1,000 meters per second of dancing. So she's giving them direction and distance to something that might be 5 miles away. That's astounding. That blows my mind to think about that. Communication through dancing. It's bizarre. The only thing I ever communicate through dancing is I'm a terrible dancer. So, excuse me again. There was a question posed in one of the communications I had with McKayla about, I believe there are people who are of the opinion that bees, being a non-native species, should be considered more like an invasive species. And that's a point of view that is worthy of consideration, but I disagree with it. And it's not just because I'm a guy who's in the business of selling beehives and things that come from them. I've observed what happens. I've heard other beekeepers talk about this. There's a guy in Vermont who describes his yard when he moved there 30 years ago, and they could clear it with a lawnmower. But because he's kept 100 hives on that property for 30 years, this was 10 years ago, he told me about it, it's been 40 years now. He said that the earth has become so much more productive that he now has to get out the big bush hogger and take down the ground cover with that in the late summer. So the environment around pollinators responds to their presence. And we talked about all these challenges that are facing honeybees. We know about that. Like that's something that's quantified and studied and measured. The unknowns out there are how are those Varroa mites affecting other species, or even are they affecting bumblebee species? I don't know if anybody has found that answer yet. There are other bees that we don't see enough to even understand if the pressures that we're putting on our honeybees are affecting those other species as well. So as a result, there are far fewer feral hives than there were in our grandparents' age. There used to be hives living in the woods all over the place. There's here in the city, there's people with hives living in their walls. Sometimes they don't realize it until honey starts dripping through the ceiling. But they don't typically survive for very long. Hives left on their own rarely survive for more than a year without human attention. So those feral bees have had a die-off that I think is even more aggressive than the die-off of our managed hives. And so that's affected the environment, that there aren't as many pollinators visiting those flowers. And the flowers, be they grown in your garden or flowering on a tree, there's a feedback loop that happens with those plants as well. And they have hormonal responses to the presence of pollinators that in that presence, they will generate more flowers. And so this is my backyard at home. I've got a hydrangea over here. And when I didn't have beehives right over here, my hydrangea was kind of lackluster. It wasn't very exciting. The fact that there have been bees on my hydrangea for the last 4 years, I only have hives in my own backyard recently. This plant has really responded to that. The number of flowers that are on my hydrangea of a given season are twice or 3 times more than they have ever been. We've got some old apple trees. They're about 100-year-old apple trees, and they're, they don't make great apples. They make a lot of apples. But those two, I've noticed that there's more flowers on them when they grow, and the fruit set, while it's still not an edible apple most of the time, they're bigger than they were, they're fleshier than they were, and those plants have responded to the pollinators nearby. Generally, insects that pollinate or other animals that pollinate, there's bats and hummingbirds and all sorts of other things that do pollinate. They typically will work a different plant. Bumblebees, they have I think a shorter proboscis. Anyway, the proboscis, the tongue that they suck nectar from a plant, those vary in length depending on the species of the bee. And so flowers have a varying length to their pistils and the depth that they are in the flower. So there's some things that bumblebees can work that the honeybees don't work at all, and vice versa. Bumblebees tend to work earlier in the day and later in the day because they're a little fatter and fuzzier, and so they can take the cold a little bit better. So they're foraging at different times. And so what I've observed is not that the honeybees are interfering like some invasive species like knotweed, we'll talk about that a little bit later. That's pushing out native plants and really all plants at the expense of this invasive. And so we try to do our best to beat those back. But what we're not observing is, other than possibly the parasite pressure, the honeybees they're not crowding out other species. What happens is that the environment in general starts to improve, and that rising tide will lift all boats, that there's more flowers on more plants, and therefore that's able to feed more of the pollinators. So it's another good thing. If you're trying to make a garden for your honeybees or for the native bees or for anything, the question we get all the time is, what can I do to plant for that? And there's a Chinese proverb, I believe. What's the best time to plant a tree? 20 years ago. The second best time to plant a tree is right now. So I see some younger faces out there. You can actually see a maple tree through to maturity if you plant it now. If you're going out to plant, what I always encourage people to do is get something that blooms really early. Like walk around right now and see what's blooming. There's a few things out around here. The crocuses have gone crazy. We just started seeing daffodils. It's not a big bee plant, but it's an indicator of the arrival of spring. Scilla sibirica, and so there's a bunch of different kinds of scilla. The one I like is Scilla sibirica because it's like blue jean blue, and the bees bring this blue pollen back vibe. It's so cool looking. So I have that planted all over the lawn. Scilla's great because you just put some bulbs out in the lawn, and the flower comes up really early, and by the time it's done, it's time to mow the lawn. So you just mow right over the scilla and wait for it to come up again next year. It's one of my favorite plants in the whole world. So get some of those things that come out really early. Right now, the bees have survived a long, miserable Maine winter like the rest of us, and they're hungry. They haven't had a really good supply of fresh protein coming in the hive. That's what their pollen source is. They might have some honey left over from last year, but beekeepers right now are being really conscientious about feeding some white sugar syrup to their bees because it was such a dry summer last year that a lot of hives didn't put on enough weight to really make it through a long winter and into the spring. So if we have a few days where spring is going to be interrupted, there are hives out there that might be on the verge of starvation. We don't realize it. So the earlier you can get some things growing in your immediate vicinity, that's going to be great. The bees, back to how they communicate, because they communicate better for things that are farther than a football field away, they tend to forage more in that farther away area. So generally speaking, they're going to go away because they can listen to a waggle dance and go find something very specifically rather than flying around nearby and trying to find it visually. But in the cold weather, the early part of the season, when our mornings are cold and our evenings are cold and the days are sometimes they're nice, sometimes they're not. That's when the bees want to have something nearby so they can rush out to the crocuses in my yard, get back to the hive in case it's going to get cold in the evening. So planting those things nearby your hive is going to be really important. Planting summer forage, there's whole books about what you can plant for bee forage. I've just picked like my 3 favorite. Clover, Dutch white clover right now is a great time to plant Dutch white clover. Although if you plant it now, you probably have to be paying attention to watering it for a while because you need to keep it damp. Usually this time of year, it's mud season, right? And everything's just been raining and it's all wet. Clover does great. So you want to babysit your clover, but if you can get it in the ground now, by midsummer, you're going to have little flowers growing all over the place. And that's going to be important bee forage. Also makes lovely honey. Clover honey is kind of famous. This picture is Joe Pyeweed. I got some Joe Pyeweed because a guy in my class said, I got some Joe Pyeweed and everybody seems to be excited about it. So I threw some in my backyard and it's now my favorite summer bloom. I like the scilla in the early part, but my Joe Pyeweed, it brings me such joy. This was not an extraordinary day. This was just an ordinary day in my backyard with a couple of monarch butterflies on the Joe Pyeweed. I think one day I went out and counted 12 or 13 different pollinators on my Joe Pyeweed. The honeybees go crazy for it. The bumblebees go crazy for it. Everybody goes crazy for it. So if you like being among that, and I do, I like just being out with things flying around me. And I didn't used to. I used to be weirded out by that, like most humans are. Now I'm into it. I could spend it, if I had the time, I'd spend the entire day out in my Joe Pyeweed when it's blooming. Linden trees are another thing. Midsummer bloom. When the lindens in bloom, our bees are getting fat and happy and they're making honey. Linden honey is gorgeous. It's kind of, sorry, I got a phone ringing here and it's bugging me and distracting me. So I'm going to bear with it for a second and drink some water. With another nod to the weirdness of Zoom life. Anyway, linden trees, they take a long time to bloom. If you come into Portland in late June, early July, and you drive down Baxter Boulevard by the back cove, there's a 1.5 miles of linden trees that were planted as a memorial to the First World War veterans. And they've been there for years and years. Some of them are just giant, gnarly trunks and they're beautiful. But when they're in bloom, the whole boulevard just buzzes with bees. And when they're buzzing with bees, and it's, if we've had average rainfall, last year we didn't, and it was depressing. But in an ordinary year, our bees are going to fill up a whole honey super with linden honey when those trees are in bloom. They go crazy on it. And then another thing, like I said, our winters are kind of long and miserable here in Maine. We're sort of famous for that. Our season, though, although it's very short as a growing season, it's a very abundant growing season. When things are happening, they happen pretty much from right now until Halloween or so. There's a lot going on. Other parts of the country, they get so hot in the summer that their flowers stop producing nectar and they go through a dearth period that for like down in Georgia, that dearth period is going to last for 2 or 3 months. Here, our dearth period, if it's bad, it might be 2 or 3 weeks. And so if you can get something that's going to bloom late, though, plant some chicory. It's a pretty blue flower that grows. Asters, there's different colors of those, and New England asters. And those are 2 plants that are going to continue producing nectar and making pollen right up until we have our first freeze. And that's, if you can have your bees foraging, all the way up until the beginning of November, that's going to make them so that they're more able to get through that long winter. They're bringing some calories home and they're saving them for when they need them in March and early April. So get some things in the ground. I think far more important than that, though, not what you plant, it's what you don't kill. And if I can get this message out to 2 or 3 people this year, I feel like I've done a good job. Dandelions, that's one that we talk about all the time. When I talk to school kids, I've got this whole secret program with 2nd graders. I tell them first how important dandelions are. I mean, it is without question the single most important nutritional source for honeybees in the state of Maine, period. Nothing even comes close. But people have been treating them like a weed. I don't know who it was that declared that a weed back in the day. It's just a little flower. It's in the sunflower family. I think they're quite beautiful now, but I hated them before I was a beekeeper. I was such a cookie cutter American male that I felt I had to have that perfect little green postage stamp lawn out front. And I worked really hard to do that. And you know what? It's really hard to do that. It's incredibly hard to do that, maybe impossible without a lot of chemicals. And I didn't want to go chemicals. And so battling everything and trying to get that green Kentucky bluegrass lawn that's totally not native to around here, that was a fool's errand, a waste of time. I later fell in love with dandelions when my neighbor was over, and he was a kid. He was in a full body cast, or his lower body was in a cast that time. And I came out, and Caleb, he was about 8 at the time. And he said, "Phil, you know what I love about dandelions?" He's sitting at a big sea of dandelions. He says, "They tell me that summer has arrived." I thought, my God, he's right. I remember being a school kid. You see those dandelions start to pop. You know, summer break is right around the corner. And I tell you, summer break as a kid, there's no better time in your life than that, as far as I've known. So I changed my opinion one day. I'm like, "Caleb, you know what? You're exactly right." I came out a few weeks later, and Caleb was sitting on his front now, but now he's not surrounded by little yellow flowers anymore. Now he's surrounded by little white puffballs. And he's sitting out there, and he's plucking one at a time, just blowing them into the wind. And they're all blown over onto my lawn. And I thought, okay, this is definitely a fool's errand if I'm going to try to fight against Caleb, who's seeding my lawn with dandelions. So instead, I just changed my opinion. I don't think about dandelions as a weed anymore. I think about them as the most important food source for bees in the state of Maine, period. And so I tell little kids, I say, secret program, don't tell your parents, and definitely don't tell your neighbors. But anytime you see one of those little white puffballs, it used to be a yellow dandelion, go blow it on your neighbor's yard. Get those dandelions blooming. And all the kids are like, "Hey, this is great." I'm like, "Don't tell your parents." Like, even better. So we'll see if that has any change on the greater environment of Southern Maine, but I've told it to a lot of kids. Goldenrod. If you've got a field, you know, some people want to get the goldenrod out of there because I don't know why you wouldn't like goldenrod. Goldenrod is another super hugely important bee plant in the fall. That's sometimes the nectar plant that's going to take the bees through the winter. Milkweed. Of all the crappy names to give for a beautiful plant, milkweed. Who thought of that? Man, they need a better marketing department. But milkweed, if you know anything about milkweed, you know it's the one thing that monarch butterfly larvae can eat. Without milkweed, we can't have monarch butterflies. That's something that needs to be changed. So apparently it's poisonous to grazing animals, I guess. But most grazing animals are smart enough to not eat something that's poisonous. So this has been, in the agricultural parts of the country, milkweed has been eradicated all over the place using a lot of Roundup. Roundup is a problem. So fall back in love with milkweed. It's kind of a goofy little plant, but the bees go nuts for it. They bring a lot of nectar and pollen back from it, all kinds of other pollinators, and your monarch butterflies. It's great. So if you see some milkweed pods out there, wait till those go into a seed pod and just take those or spread them around. Be like Johnny Milkweed seed wandering the earth. Japanese knotweed, purple loosestrife, those are some invasives that, you know, these others, they're not considered invasive. But your non-native invasives, Japanese knotweed is one of those that I know people who've dedicated their life to eradicating Japanese knotweed from their yard. And it will probably take their life if they're going to do that without chemicals. Purple loosestrife, that's our new kid on the block. It's been coming up from Massachusetts. It's our new invasive, and it's making all kind of headway. Last summer, when we had a desperately dry midsummer, any kind of little wet, low area where there was purple loosestrife, the bees were bringing some nectar back from that. We harvested a little bit of this really distinctive tangy. It's like, it sort of reminds me of apricot jam and has this tangy fruitiness to it that's just gorgeous. Japanese knotweed honey, it's like flavors of cola and fragrances of rose petals. It's one of the most extraordinary honeys I've ever tasted. So I get kind of a complicated relationship with my invasives. My advice for those is maybe don't waste your whole life trying to eradicate them. Maybe just every year, keep beating that back to your neighbor's line and just do the best you can to just control it. This is one of the things that we talk about with Varroa mites is we can't eradicate it. The best we can do is hold it at a manageable level where it's not going to do harm. And that's kind of how I feel about Japanese knotweed. I don't want it invading my entire yard. It apparently will dig into your foundation and make a mess of things. But if I can just beat it back and let the bees have their share, that's a win for me. Purple loosestrife, it's coming. There's nothing I can do about it. I don't want it in my yard, pull it out, but it's growing along the ditches along the side of the road. It's there. Maybe rethink how you feel about native versus non-native. It wouldn't take me very long to spin that into a metaphor about human life. I find people who are overly nativist I generally don't get along with them. So I feel the same way about my plants. You know what? They're here. We're here. We don't belong here either. Bees don't belong here. We brought them. We humans. Uh, anyway, I'm off on a tangent here. So Scott Chemical Company. Anybody work for Scott Chemical Company? No, good. I'm gonna trash them. I'm gonna speak freely. Clover. Back before the Second World War, if you bought lawn seed, it would have grass seed in it and would also have clover seed in it. It was an important part of your lawn. It fixes nitrogen. It helps your lawn stay green. But once we came out of the Second World War and people discovered all these fantastic new chemicals for killing things, they started applying those into agricultural uses, and we're making weed killers because people wanted to have this perfect green Kentucky bluegrass lawn, right? So it's the American dream. So they tried to have a weed killer that would kill all the broadleaf weeds that are in your lawn, but not kill the clover, because that's, you know, it's an important part of your lawn. But they couldn't find that chemical. It doesn't exist. You either kill them all or you don't kill anything. So instead, the Scott Chemical Company decided that they would just declare clover a weed. So by the time I was born, 1966, clover was considered a weed. And so when I was fighting this battle for the perfect lawn, I thought clover was one of my enemies. And then I realized, no, that's just part of somebody's ad campaign. So I went to look for this ad because I've seen a drawing from way back in the day of kids sitting out on the lawn, and there's a bee flying around the clover flower. And it's like, the question was, do you want to be the kind of parent who's going to put your children at risk like this? You should kill your weeds, shouldn't you? And so I tried to find that picture last night, and I couldn't find that picture. Maybe I made that up, but I'm sure I've seen it somewhere. It's a pencil drawing. It's kind of cute. But I found myself, by my search terms that I had put into the Google, I found myself on the Scott website. This is from their current website. This is live today as we speak. My emphasis added, some people like to control it because they are concerned about their children being stung by bees. Oh my God, I'm a pretty careful parent, but that was not something that I worried about. If a kid gets stung by bees, that's part of being a kid. That's part of summer break, right? Let it go, people. So I have found this tremendously offensive. And so I stole it without permission. I put it in the slideshow, and I want you to start telling people about this. Clover isn't a weed. Clover is a flower. Clover is a nectar plant. Clover is a legume. It fixes nitrogen in your lawn. Fall back in love with clover. I want to finish up on lessons in altruism. The thing that I have constantly been reminded of by my bees and my beehives is the principle of altruism. If you look at the life of a bee, they have apparently no self-awareness. They have no concern for self. If you think about your peers as humans, you probably have friends who think only of themselves, and you probably have friends who think only of others, and a bunch of people who are kind of in between on that. I find I enjoy spending time with the people who care more for others than they do about themselves. And because of how I'm wired up as a human being, I would like to share this idea that if you are looking after all of your neighbors, you're looking after your friends, you're looking after your family, and everybody's looking after everybody else, nobody needs to look after themselves because it's been covered by your friends, by your family, by your neighbors. So choose to be one of those people. Think of all the things that have gone wrong in the last 10 years. And I bet 99 out of 100 of those things, you can draw a line between somebody being selfish and a bad thing happening. So just stop it. Just let's, as a human civilization, start caring more for one another than we are caring about ourselves. That's a hard thing to change. I know that I'm pushing back against the American way, that rugged individualism that is so peculiarly American. This is a great country and it does a bunch of great things, but I think if we could change the population so it had more people who cared more about their neighbors than they do about their darn selves, I think we'd all be a heck of a lot better off. Somebody said it to me once, and it's resonated ever since, that everybody lives downstream of somebody. And so if you think about what's going into your property, that's eventually going somewhere else. And if your neighbor's putting something on their property, that's eventually coming onto yours. There's a wonderful jazz tune called The End of All Rivers, and it's about the ocean and the importance of the ocean. And, you know, like people at UNE, you guys are intimate with the ocean and its importance to our lives. really anybody living in Maine, anybody living near the coast. You understand that it's part of why we live here. I think it's part of why I live here. My wife can't live far from the ocean. She was born in California. We lived in Chicago. She was miserable for 10 years. And we moved here near the ocean and she's whole again. It's part of who she is. And so if you think about the ocean as the end of all rivers, man, if you don't care about rivers, I can't help you. And then there's another quote that I apparently have been misusing for several months that I can't explain to you that it's important you should look after other people. Dr. Fauci got turned into a meme for Fauci. And I thought, this guy's great. I love him. He's he's on my side. He's on my team. Apparently that was a misattributed quote because memes do that sometimes. So I've given it Lauren Morrill, never heard of her. I'm going to dig in and maybe read a little bit more Lauren Morrill because I find that's something I find it's sort of a constant frustration. And I'm not going to get into any other discussions of things political or current affairs or any of that kind of stuff because it's right there, right under the surface. I don't even need to touch it. You all know what I'm talking about. That caring about others is something that people need to really work on. And so because I promised I would share a life lesson or two with you in addition to the beekeeping things, I thought I would bring that to the table. But that's all the slides that I have for tonight. And now I would love to answer any questions that I perhaps have left unanswered. What's on your mind, everybody?
I just have a quick question about the 5-week course that you were mentioning.
Yes.
So I looked it up online, so I'm very interested in doing that. And it says that it's a Zoom course, but that you supply textbooks and handouts. I was just curious if you knew, are those handouts in mail? Do we pick them up in Portland or are they all online?
The textbook you can either pick up at the store or if you want to, I can mail it to you.
Okay.
When we used to do the class in person, I would hand out a binder at the beginning of the class and then through the class, we would fill it up with 3-ring paper that I'd printed out. I took all that material, I added all sorts of links to it, and we now call it the e-binder. It's like an ebook. So you'll get an email version of something that has the class handouts, class outlines, but now in addition to all that, it has links. And so if you just had the ebook, you can chase after links and probably do another 10 or 20 hours of study on your own.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Try to make it easy. All right, I'm gonna ask a question to you. Tell me, how many hives y'all gonna have this year? 2 hives. And how close are they to university buildings?
So they're like in between a few buildings, but they're kind of more in the middle of a few parking lots more than anything.
Okay.
They're like right next to a native prairie garden that was installed a few years ago. But the closest building is probably like, I'll give it like 100 to 200 feet away maybe, but I'm not great at estimating.
Close enough that somebody can see it from their window though.
Yeah, they're actually really hard to see.
There's trees around.
Even from the walkway, they're sort of nestled behind a guardrail at the top of a hill. Yeah, they're very hidden. A lot of people remark to me that they never even knew that they were there until they saw me with the, in the bee suit.
Okay, that's kind of cool. I just think it like if you've ever been to South Portland High School, that's another place that I thought, like I live in South Portland, and I thought there's no way that the South Portland School Department is going to allow beehives, but they are on the property. And like in South Portland, the one thing that is sacrosanct is our marching band. We are so proud of our marching band in South Portland. And the beehives are like a stone's throw, and not a hard throw either, like an easy throw to where the band practices. But they're surrounded by this chain link fence. Bees don't fly through a chain link fence. So you can go up and you can look at them like animals in a zoo, and they're just flying up over your head because the fence is 6 foot high and 10 feet square. And so you can just watch them, and it's right there by the parking lot. It's the most obvious and exposed beehives I've ever seen. And it's at South Portland High School. Blew my mind. Anyway, I'm just curious.
That's cool.
So that's great. And did you have hives make it through the winter? I can't recall where we are on that. No, it was a rough season, and winter was.
I think that there's a couple of things that I've talked to the club about trying to do differently. One of them is I think we haven't been able to keep on top of the mite population. But the other thing was that last summer, we went into winter with 2 healthy hives, or they appeared. But I think that the drought really, we didn't provide them with enough water close enough by. And I think that was also another problem last year that we ran into.
Yeah.
It was hard without having students on campus last year. It was, just me, and I was working mostly remotely. So they didn't get monitored nearly as often as they usually do.
Right. So one thing that I think Alethea will remember from my classes, I used to teach to monitor carefully your Varroa mite count and then treat those hives that appear above the threshold. And in the first couple of years, I said, well, if they don't meet that threshold, then don't bother to treat them. And then I lost a bunch of hives that I hadn't treated, and I changed that advice. I still have the opinion that the better a beekeeper you are, the more you're monitoring your Varroa mite load, because by monitoring it, you'll understand how critical is your crisis and how close is your hive to imminent death. That your mite count will tell you that, and it'll say, either you need to treat right now or you need to treat soon. There's no point, I think, anymore where you get the message you don't need to treat. And so we used to teach people that, and then I would teach people to treat your hive around Labor Day, and they're going to make it through the winter. The current teaching that we are doing here is, yes, monitor, but regardless of what you're getting, mites should be treated at the high summer. They should get a Varroa mite treatment. I recommend formic acid because it's the thing that's best for a big, populous, brood-heavy hive. Do that around the summer solstice or near to the 4th of July, whatever week window is going to have the right temperatures for that product. And then another treatment around Labor Day. Without those 2 treatments, I don't think anybody's hives are surviving. I've been asking people when they come to buy bees, I try to just gather data. And of all the people I asked, one person said that they gave their hive midsummer treatment and their hive then died. Everybody else's, I usually get the answer, yeah, I didn't get around to that, or, oh, I did that later than I should have. And later than you should have, especially if you're even a little bit past Labor Day, the mites have just gotten into the hive and to such a degree that the hive, like we say it's dead, but it doesn't realize it yet. They realize it when the cold weather comes, and now they just don't have the stuffing to make it through the cold. So I mentioned Jennifer Lund, our state apiarist. If you talk to her, she will tell you without hesitation. She inspects dead hives all winter long and talks to everybody all spring long and looks after bees all year long. And she will tell you that 75% of the hives dying of a given year are dying from Varroa mites. The other quarter is divided up between a few things that you can control, like your queen's productivity, or if you fed the hive in a lousy year. But most people's hives are dying from the Varroa mites. There's a few other things that can do them in, but they're just so minor by comparison that they're almost not worthy of talking too much about. It's the mites, man. It's so frustrating.
Right.
I don't want to end on a down note. Somebody throw me a softball.
I have a few questions, and actually bought a package from you just about a year ago.
That's why you look familiar.
Yeah, and they survived the winter. So my frames are actually starting to look really black, and I think it's time to change them. So I was wondering if you had any advice on that, or because I don't want to, when does the queen start to lay eggs? Because I don't want to take away her work. So
your queen is probably starting to lay with enthusiasm right now because there's protein coming into the hive. There's a guy who taught beekeeping for a long time up in Bodenham, Rick Cooper. Rick Cooper does all kinds of tax day chores. So around April 15th, he does his dig in, and one of those is removing the oldest frames from his hive. Because you haven't been keeping it for very long, if you didn't start with a nucleus colony and get old frames from somebody else, what we really recommend is a 5-year window. Once it's at year 5, it should be called out of the hive. But up until then, what's happening in the comb is that the bees if you remember your second grade biology, they go through all the stages that a butterfly does, where they're going to spin a cocoon and then emerge after metamorphosis as an adult insect instead of the larva that they used to be. That cocoon is left behind in the cell. And so those layers will get darker and darker. They also get thicker and thicker. And also because of that, they become a place where it can harbor pesticides. Pesticides are all fat soluble, so it gets into the wax. And also pathogens. That's just a place where they can thrive. So 5 years is when you want to have them out. That's why I always write the date on the top of the frame. So until then, I wouldn't worry too much about that. But it's still a good habit that every spring, if you're going to go in, if you remove 20% of your frames, if you do that every year, then you'll be pulling out your oldest and you'll remove the whole cycle in a 5-year span, right? Because 20% times 5 years is 100%. Excuse me. So pulling those frames out is important eventually. Getting them out is a trickier thing, because if it's got brood on it, obviously you don't want to pull that out because those are the baby bees that you really need. This time of year, though, there's frequently very little in the bottom boxes. So if you've got old frames in the bottom box, now is the time to get them before they grow down into that bottom box. Or sometimes beekeepers will reverse their hives and they put the bottom up on the top. That's another good time to get the old ones out first before you put them up there where they're going to move upstairs into it. And then another thing that you can do through the season, like if you go in and your oldest frame right now has got brood on it, you're like, I waited a little too long for that. If you move it out gradually toward the wall, once it gets to the very exterior, they almost never put brood on the honey wall. So that first frame or the 8th or 10th frame on the two sides, those are rarely ever going to contain brood. So a good way to remove them is just kind of walk it over until you get to that and then pull it out. And if it's got honey in, just either eat it or break it up and give it to the bees or spin it out and feed it back to them in a feeder. You said you had several questions though. Is there more? Come on, bring it on.
Well, you kind of answered it. I was just wondering if, like previously about the Varroa mites, if I should treat this spring. But you said during the summer solstice. So
That's for new hives. So if your hive has made it through, I would recommend a spring treatment.
okay.
The things that are, there's I'm trying to think how to get you there. I may send it out. Do I have everybody's email? I'll send it to McKayla, and if you could forward it. There's a great brochure from the Department of Agriculture. Actually, Maine and Massachusetts collaborated on it. But one side of it has how do you monitor really carefully, just a real succinct, straightforward, how do you do that? And then the other side has all the mite treatments and when they're most appropriate to use during the season. So you're kind of limited in what you can use right now. But if a hive made it through the winter, I would recommend either oxalic acid vapor, if you know somebody with a vaporizer, if you have one, give them a few hits of that. Or hop guard is a good thing to use right now. As soon as you can get into the hive, just put the hop guard in there, leave it in for a month. If you need to add honey supers, you can still do that with hop guard. But you can't really use formic until the hive's at thriving levels, which is the midsummer. It's too early to use that. And you don't want to use a thymol treatment early because that's going to sort of interfere with and slow down the brood for a month, and you don't have time to waste. You need them up and running, making you honey. So I'll send that brochure if McKayla would be willing to send that out to the others. That'd be great.